What happens when 82 children vanish from an institution overnight, leaving behind nothing but empty beds and erased records? Was it neglect, conspiracy, or something darker hidden in the walls of America's oldest school for the feeble-minded? The question lingers like a shadow that refuses to die. Welcome, viewers, to Gothic Ledger. Tonight we open the sealed doors of the Walter E. Fernald State School, where progress and cruelty walked hand in hand, and where silence covered a disappearance too vast to ignore. Before we begin, I want to know something from you. Tell us down in the comments the exact time and place you are watching this story from. Are you alone in the late hours of the night, or surrounded by the noise of day? Every location, every moment adds to the ledger of voices uncovering the past. And if you have not already, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and press like, because the more you engage, the more stories we can exhume from the archives, bringing the forgotten back into the light. The beds are empty, the records silent, but the question remains, what truly happened to the 82 children of Fernald? The wards of the Walter E. Fernald State School lay in an unnatural hush that autumn night, October 15, 1953. Electric bulbs buzzed faintly overhead, their glow reduced by years of grime clinging to the glass. The radiators hissed in bursts, filling the tiled corridors with a low, uneven breath. At 2:00 a.m., Night Supervisor Margaret Kellaway carried her clipboard into Ward C, the pencil poised between her fingers in the well-rehearsed rhythm of a census she had conducted hundreds of times before. She expected the same rows of children under stiff institutional blankets, faces turned to the wall, the routine order that defined her years of work. The first anomaly was subtle. A bed, neatly made, untouched since evening, though the nurse on duty had marked it occupied. Then another and another. Margaret stopped counting with her pencil at 30, her throat tightening as her eyes scanned the vacant sheets. What began as a clerical concern transformed into an expanding void. Beds stripped of bodies, the silence not the gentle quiet of sleep, but the hollow vacancy of absence. She moved down the ward, her steps echoing unnaturally loud against the tile, until the emptiness could no longer be denied. She crossed quickly to Ward D, then E, her clipboard trembling in her hands. The pattern repeated itself. Rows of beds undisturbed, no shoes by the doors, no toys on the floor, no small bodies shifting under the covers. It was as if the air itself had consumed them. By the time she returned to her office, the tally stood at 82 missing children. The final number struck like a blunt instrument. 82. Neither a mistake of paperwork nor a quiet transfer. This was absence on a scale no institution could explain away. The protocols demanded she contact the superintendent immediately. The call went through at 2:37 a.m., her voice clipped and urgent. Superintendent Raymond. Ross responded not with alarm but with clipped silence, asking only whether her count had been verified. She confirmed it, her voice breaking slightly. He ordered her to seal the log and continue her rounds as if nothing had occurred. "The morning staff will address it," he said before ending the call. The line clicked dead, leaving her in the hum of the switchboard room, staring at the receiver as if it might speak again. Back at her desk, Margaret opened the official census log. She wrote the numbers with deliberate care, noting the empty beds in their proper lines. Then, hesitating, she took a separate scrap of paper from her drawer and copied them again in her own hand, as though preserving a truth already threatened with erasure. When dawn came, the official log showed every bed accounted for. Her duplicate list, hidden beneath the lining of her desk drawer, recorded 82 absences. At 6:00 a.m., the corridors filled with the bustle of morning staff. The kitchen carts clattered, doors slammed, and the low murmur of children rose again. Yet in the wards Margaret had walked hours earlier, the silence still clung. Beds stood unoccupied, sheets smoothed too perfectly, as though waiting for children who would never return. When the doors of the Massachusetts School for the Feeble-Minded first opened in 1848, the air carried the optimism of reform. Founded in Boston under the leadership of Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, the institution was envisioned as a place of sanctuary, where children considered defective might be educated and redeemed through discipline, order, and moral training. The architecture reflected its mission: long brick corridors bathed in natural light, wide windows overlooking orchards and farmland. In those early years, reformers spoke of hope, of lifting children from neglect and giving them purpose. But even in its idealistic beginnings, shadows lengthened. By the turn of the century, renamed the Walter E. Fernald State School, the institution bore the stamp of its most ambitious superintendent, Dr. Walter Fernald himself. He was a zealous advocate of the eugenics movement, a man who believed that intelligence and morality were written into bloodlines. Under his tenure, the language of education shifted quietly into that of classification. Children were no longer simply wards to be taught, they were specimens to be studied, their futures determined less by opportunity than by heredity. By 1910, the school had swelled with hundreds of residents, its population far exceeding capacity. Daily life grew regimented, stripped of warmth. Children labored in fields and workshops, their training serving as unpaid labor to sustain the institution. The idyllic windows and orchards became a facade. Within, the atmosphere tightened into surveillance and control. This was no longer a school, but a closed world, where bodies and minds were measured, catalogued, and reduced to data points in the growing science of eugenics. Prominent figures of the early 20th century praised Fernald as a model. The Carnegie Institution funded studies conducted within its walls. The Eugenics Record O. FICE, led by Charles Davenport, drew heavily on Fernald's files to argue that feeble-mindedness was inherited and must be contained. The school became less a refuge and more a laboratory in which the state sought to prove its power over human lineage. Each resident represented not a life to be nurtured, but a case study in defective heredity. This transformation etched itself into the very routines of daily life. Morning inspections measured cleanliness and posture, not comfort. Meals were standardized and sparse, served in echoing dining halls where children sat silently in rows. The walls bore charts of family trees, showing degeneracy traced through generations. Records noted not only behavior but ancestry, reducing complex lives to simple, damning diagrams. The architecture that once promised openness now confined, its tall fences and locked gates remind us that Fernald had become less a school and more a fortress. By the 1930s and 1940s, as sterilization laws spread across America, Fernald stood as both justification and participant. Hundreds of its residents were sterilized, often without consent, their names erased from genealogies. Behind the rhetoric of progress, the institution had become an engine of social control, cloaked in the authority of science. What began as a sanctuary hardened into a citadel of secrecy, where the vulnerable were not protected but preserved as material for study. The irony lay heavy. A place born from reform became the proving ground for the darkest ambitions of eugenics. The breakfast trays rattled against steel counters each morning in the Fernald dining hall, the sound sharp against the cavernous walls. Metal spoons clinked into chipped bowls, and ladles poured steaming oatmeal that smelled faintly of malt. To the children, it was routine. Food served in silence, trays slid down long wooden tables. To the staff, it was data collection in progress. Beginning in 1946, those bowls carried more than sustenance. They carried trace doses of radioactive isotopes, stirred invisibly into the morning meal. Behind this deception stood a quiet partnership between the Walter E. Fernald State School, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the United States Atomic Energy Commission. Documents later revealed that boys recruited into a so-called science club were told they would receive special privileges, trips to Red Sox games, extra snacks, and a sense of belonging. In exchange, they agreed to what were described as nutrition studies. Neither the children nor their parents were told that the real experiment involved feeding radioactive calcium and iron to minors in state custody. MIT scientists, led by Dr. Robert S. Harris, recorded the results with precision. By tracking the absorption of isotopes, they sought to understand how nutrients move through the body, knowledge that could help refine radiation safety standards in the atomic age. But the choice of subjects was no accident. Fernald's population, largely children of the poor, disabled or abandoned, offered the perfect test group, accessible, voiceless, and unprotected. Consent forms, where they existed, spoke only of nutritional research. Parents were told their children would benefit from improved diets, never that they would ingest substances linked to cancer and genetic damage. The science club carried an air of reward. Members were invited to decorate a private room with posters and games, privileges rare in the regimented environment of Fernald. They were praised for their participation, made to feel chosen. In truth, their bodies became vessels for a national experiment. Blood samples were drawn, stools collected, bones measured by X-ray. To a boy, the daily spoonful of oatmeal seemed harmless. To the scientists, each bite was a data point in the growing ledger of radiation studies. By the early 1950s, hundreds of doses had been administered. Reports were filed to Washington, where the Atomic Energy Commission classified the findings as part of its Cold War portfolio. The language of the documents was clinical, stripped of any trace of the human cost. Subject 17 ingested 10 microcuries of calcium-45, uptake noted at 43%. Behind every number was a boy with a name, a mother who wrote letters, a body that carried the invisible burden of state secrecy. It was not until decades later, in the 1990s, that survivors testified before Congress, describing their confusion and betrayal. Some remembered the pride of being chosen for the science club, only to learn 50 years on that they had been used as test subjects in one of the darkest collisions of science and secrecy in American history. At Fernald, breakfast was never just breakfast. It was a quiet ritual of exposure, a spoonful of the atomic age served under the guise of enrichment. The ink bled slightly into the coarse paper, each stroke of Mary Brennan's pen pressed harder than the last. "My dearest Tommy, I hope you are eating well. Do they give you milk with your supper? I pray every night you are not cold in your bed." Her script tilted forward as though rushing to close the distance between mother and son. This letter, dated March 2nd, 1950, was one of dozens she sent to the Walter E. Fernald State School after her 9-year-old boy was admitted. Tommy had been placed at Fernald for what state officials described as mild developmental delays. In reality, his family had fallen into poverty after his father's death in a mill accident, and Mary, alone with 3 children, was persuaded by social workers that Fernald could provide stability. Admission records show his arrival on a rainy evening in December 1949. Thomas Brennan, age 9, intake classification, moron grade, IQ 58. The language was clinical, unyielding, reducing him to a number on a page. Life for Tommy quickly assumed the rhythm of the institution. He rose at 6 o'clock a.m., washed in cold water from tin basins, and ate oatmeal in the cavernous dining hall. His days alternated between schooling and labor, sometimes in the fields, sometimes sorting laundry. Mary's letters reached him sporadically, smuggled into his pocket by sympathetic attendants. She wrote of home, the lilacs blooming outside their Somerville tenement, his younger sister learning to write her name, the parish priest who asked after him. She reminded him he was loved, even in absence. But the replies she received, when they came at all, were brief, unsigned notes in a child's uncertain hand. Then, beginning in 1951, the trail thinned. Mary's letters began returning unopened, stamped resident unavailable. She wrote directly to Superintendent Raymond Ross, pleading for explanation. "I have sent 10 letters, and not one has been answered. Is my boy ill? Has he been moved?" The responses, when they came, were terse. "Your son is participating in extended studies. Contact will resume at a later date." No further detail was given. Archival evidence shows Tommy's name appearing on rosters connected to the so-called science club, those selected for radiation experiments. blood draws, dental x-rays, isotope ingestion. The records list subject 42, Brennan T., alongside numerical dosages. His last confirmed entry in the Fernald log appears on October 3, 1953, just 12 days before Margaret Kellaway's midnight census revealed the 82 vanished. After that, the line of his life goes blank. Mary continued to write. By her own count, she sent 47 letters over 4 years. 23 were acknowledged as delivered, the rest disappeared into the machinery of the institution. In her final surviving letter, dated May 14, 1954, she wrote simply, "If my son is gone, tell me. A mother can bear sorrow, but she cannot bear silence." No reply was ever recorded. The silence became her inheritance. In the official files of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Thomas Brennan ceased to exist. In the hidden ledger of his mother's heart, he remained forever 9 years old, waiting for a letter he would never read. The files of Dr. Clemens Bender were written in the dry cadence of science, yet beneath their language ran a current of quiet violence. A surviving memorandum dated 1949 notes, Subject 108, Mongoloid stigmata evident, family history, epileptic uncle, institutionalized cousin, prognosis, hereditary defect, retained for extended study. The words stripped away the child's name, replacing it with categories of bloodline and deficiency. To Bender, these notes were not children, but entries in a genetic ledger, fragments of a broader pattern he sought to map. Bender, an Austrian-born psychiatrist who became chief of research at Fernald, was shaped by the transatlantic dialogue of eugenics. He trained in a Europe still steeped in theories of degeneracy and inheritance, arriving in America with the conviction that family bloodlines determined mental fitness. His goal at Fernald was to assemble not merely case studies, but dynasties of defect, a library of heredity he believed would prove the inevitability of social hierarchy. The process of selection began at intake. Every child admitted to Fernald was classified not only by their intelligence score, but by family history, physical features, and recorded ancestry. Applications asked about epilepsy, alcoholism, criminality, and mental defectives in the bloodline. Those with extended networks of relatives marked by poverty or disability were flagged as high value for study. The more generations of data available, the more useful the child became. For the institution, lineage was currency. From there, the methods grew more intimate. Annual physicals recorded head circumference, limb proportions, and eye spacing. Dental impressions were catalogued. Handwriting samples were preserved as evidence of neurological defect. Even photographs, children made to stand against cold backdrops, expressionless by command, were inserted into file as visual proof of hereditary flaws. Each record became a portrait of alleged defect, indexed not by humanity, but by genetic worth. The consequences were profound. Children deemed useful for study were retained far longer than their original sentences of institutionalization. Families who petitioned for release found their requests denied on scientific grounds. The child remains valuable to ongoing hereditary research. One denial letter read in 1952, refusing to return an 11-year-old girl to her mother. In effect, Bender's classifications held the force of a sentence. Those marked as genetically rich for study could vanish into the system indefinitely. For the children themselves, the toll was both physical and psychological. Repeated examinations, invasive measurements, and constant reminders that they were defective etched themselves into identity. Testimony decades later recalled how some children whispered that their families didn't want them back, not realizing it was Bender's files, not parental choice, that sealed their fate. In academic journals, Bender's name appeared with authority. He published on Mongolism, cretinism, and the heredity of feeble-mindedness, citing case series drawn directly from Fernald wards. In the quiet language of science, his work advanced careers, earned citations, and justified policy. Yet in the wards, the harvest continued. Children were chosen not for who they were, but for the blood they carried. An invisible inheritance turned into an institutional possession. Behind locked doors, Fernald became less an asylum than an archive of flesh. The true harvest was never the bodies themselves, but the patterns their genes seemed to write. For Dr. Bender, it was the perfect collection. For the children, it was a life reduced to lineage, a fate sealed by the ink of someone else's files. The typewriter struck like a metronome in the records office. Keys chattering, carriage ringing, carbon paper smudging fingertips the color of old bruises. Ink dried to a sheen on duplicate forms while a rubber date stamp thudded out October nights. A clerk drew a line through a boy's name, then pressed her blotter flat, as if weight alone could make the change permanent. The process began upstairs, not in the ward. A list arrived from research with initials rather than names, pulled from Dr. Bender's files, annotated in pencil. Retain, transfer, close. The superintendent's secretary clipped it to a manila folder and wrote a neat heading in blue pencil. Disposition. In that packet lived forked paths, a medical discharge, a family retrieval, an interstate transfer, or most final, deceased, off premises. Each explanation had a corresponding form. Each form had a blank where a life once fit. Step 1 moved quickly. Pull the MasterCard from the metal index, the one with the child's intake number and ward assignment. Step 2. Generate cover paperwork. If the pretext was transfer, the clerk typed a destination from a familiar handful. Belchertown State School, Wrentham. Occasionally a distant facility reachable by state car and silence. If death served better, a memorandum noted acute complication at an outside infirmary, never named. A cooperating physician supplied a signature that did not invite questions. The carbon copies whispered against one another, 3 layers deep. Nurses in the ward provided the counter-signature, always the charge nurse on duty, never the attendant who might hesitate. They learned the choreography, sign here, initial there, say little. An orderly unscrewed the brass nameplate from the bed frame and slipped it into his pocket. The mattress was turned, the sheets drawn tight, the blanket folded to a perfect edge as though awaiting inspection. Personal items, threadbare sweater, penny book, a postcard, went into a brown carton, chalked with an intake number, carried to a boiler room shelf with other numbered ghosts. Timing mattered. The records office prided itself on speed. A polished routine brought the whole operation under half an hour. A practice team could do it faster. One clerk later said she could clear a file in the time it took to finish a cigarette. She learned not to read the letters stapled inside, though the envelopes sometimes split and bled their contents. "Are you warm at night?" across her desk. Not everyone complied cleanly. Nurse Dorothy Sullivan began keeping a parallel ledger in a cheap school notebook. The paper soft and absorbent, the pencil strokes dense. Date, hour, child's first name, ward, pretext, initials of the authorizing staffer. She folded the pages into the lining of her uniform when she left. Down the hall, Margaret Kellaway hid a duplicate census in her desk. Both women understood that the danger lay not only in the taking, but in the perfect paper it left behind. Transport followed paper. A state van idled at the service entrance before dawn, the driver's log stamped only with mileage. If the destination was within the network, a familiar guard rode shotgun. If farther, the packet included a letter of introduction signed, per superintendent. On arrival, the receiving staff filed the child under a fresh number, laundered history, or filed nothing at all. Morning restored the institution's surface order. Kitchen trays rattled, laundry carts squealed, the day book on the nurse's station declared, all accounted. When a parent wrote, the correspondence office returned a phrase stamped in violet ink, resident unavailable, or forwarded a form letter promising contact upon completion of studies. The master index, now 1 card lighter, aligned with the ward book, with the van log, with the transfer memo, with the doctor's note. Paper agreed with paper, and the agreement was taken for truth. In the records room, the carbon sheets exhaled their chemical breath. A clerk capped her fountain pen, centered the stack, and slid the folder into the cabinet. Metal rails whispered shut. On the spine, a fresh label covered the old. The bed was made with hospital precision, corners tucked sharp, the pillow flat as stone. Across the aisle, its twin bed bore the weight of a sleeping boy, breathing steady, hand curled around the edge of a coarse blanket. The absence beside him was not yet spoken aloud, but it pressed into the ward like a draught under a locked door. Stanislaw and Piotr Kowalski arrived at Fernald in November 1947, 10 years old, the sons of Polish immigrants who had lost work during the post-war recession in Worcester. Their intake forms noted identical appearance, IQ scores within 2 points of each other, and family history negative for defect. The boys were admitted not because of deficiency, but because poverty and state welfare officers deemed the household unsuitable. The school saw in them an opportunity, matched specimens for controlled comparison. The files show how carefully the twins were catalogued, blood types confirmed, dental casts taken, photographs fixed to manila folders, front, profile, smile, forced by command. They were enrolled in the so-called science club, where every dose of oatmeal laced with calcium-45 could be weighed against 2 bodies born from the same line. Stanislaw was designated the control, his meals left unaltered. Piotr received the isotopes. Their growth charts were pinned side by side in Dr. Bender's office, twin columns of measurements diverging fraction by fraction. The boys themselves remained bound by their closeness. Staff recorded how they refused to eat apart, whispered in Polish before lights out, and clutched hands when separated for exams. In the dining hall, one boy often slid his spoon into the other's bowl when attendants turned away. The science of separation collided with the instinct of kinship. By autumn 1953, discrepancies appeared in the records. Piotr's weight stalled. His blood samples showed abnormalities. Notes in the research file read, Subject 122, displaying inconsistent uptake. Consider removal. The language was clinical, detached from the boy it described. Weeks later, during the October census, his name was crossed from the ward roster. The official explanation typed into the file, transferred to Wrentham for specialized care. No transfer receipt has ever surfaced. Stanislaw remained. His bedmate gone, he slept fitfully, waking attendants with sudden cries in Polish. Gdzie on jest? Where is he? Staff reported night terrors and behavioral disruptions, recommending disciplinary measures. In truth, he was a child marking absence, his half torn away in silence. Nurses noted his reluctance to eat, his refusal to enter the science club room alone. The research files, however, praised his stability as control. His survival became the baseline against which the vanished brother's absence was measured. Family letters reveal the mother's confusion. She wrote to Fernald in December 1953, asking why only one son's Christmas card had been received. The reply from the superintendent was curt. Piotr has been relocated for medical reasons. Continued correspondence may be directed here. No address was given. In later years, Stanislaw carried the shadow of his brother into adulthood. Interviews conducted in the 1980s record him describing dreams in which Piotr still spoke to him in the night. I feel him with me like a missing half. For the institution, he remained a successful subject, control data extending across decades. For the man, he was forever a twin who slept beside an empty bed, haunted by the silence left in Piotr's place. Steel wheels shrieked against the tracks as the Boston Main night train pulled from the station, its freight cars shuddering in the cold October dark. Hidden among the cargo were crates with no bills of lading, sealed with state tags. They contained not goods, but files, folders of children's names rerouted between institutions, their lives reduced to paperwork packed and shipped through a network that never appeared in public ledgers. The transfer system that linked Fernald to other facilities operated beneath the veneer of legitimate bureaucracy. Official memos spoke of temporary relocation or specialized study, stamped with the seals of state schools in Belchertown, Wrentham, and even as far as Letchworth Village in New York. In practice, children were shuffled in silence, their numbers reassigned, their histories scrubbed. Each move served a purpose: to diversify study populations, to test environmental variables, or simply to disperse witnesses before families asked too many questions. Records uncovered in the 1980s reveal how calculated this network was. One Fernald memorandum, dated January 12, 1952, lists 15 children marked for transfer by rail, with arrival coordinated to match research timetables at MIT and affiliated hospitals. Another notes a boy dispatched to Pennsylvania for advanced thyroid uptake study. His original file closed at Fernald with a single line: transferred out. No receiving institution ever confirmed his presence. The logistics required layers of complicity. Drivers of state vans delivered children to rail depots in the pre-dawn hours, where clerks signed off on waybills coded only by initials. Conductors looked the other way, accustomed to sealed crates bearing state insignia. At the far end, administrators opened the packets, assigned new intake numbers, and filed children under fresh names, as though they had materialized. Without pasts. To resist was to lose one's post. To comply was to maintain the smooth rhythm of institutional exchange. Survivor testimony adds a human layer to the machinery. One recalled being woken before dawn, handed a small suitcase, and driven for hours before arriving at another campus of brick and bars. He remembered the smell of disinfectant, the sting of a new intake photograph, and the shock of being told his name was no longer his own. "They said I was someone different now," he told investigators decades later. "As if the boy I had been had never existed." Families were the last to learn of these movements, if at all. Letters sent to Fernald were returned stamped "no longer in residence," yet no forwarding address was ever supplied. Mothers arrived at the gates demanding to see children, only to be told they had been relocated for care, without explanation. Some searched other state schools in vain, walking miles through wards of strangers, asking for faces no one admitted had passed through. The network left almost no witnesses outside its walls. Its strength lay in its invisibility, transfers disguised as routine, signatures dispersed across jurisdictions, records sealed under the authority of public institutions. On paper, every child still existed somewhere. In reality, many were lost to the silence between institutions, carried along rails and roads into the folds of a system designed to erase while appearing to protect. The graphite of her pencil smudged across the page as Dorothy Sullivan bent low over her desk. To her left sat the official ward ledger, neat, clinical, aligned with the orders of her superiors. To her right, hidden beneath a stack of worn nursing manuals, rested a cheap spiral notebook with lined paper softened by repeated erasure. With practiced care, she copied each child's name twice, once into the sanctioned record, once into the shadow ledger, meant only for her conscience. Dorothy Sullivan had joined the staff at Fernald in 1946, a young nurse with training from St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Brighton. She had come believing in the institution's mission to educate and protect, only to discover wards that resembled warehouses where children were numbered rather than named. The first incident that shook her came in 1949, when a boy she had tended for months vanished overnight. In the morning, the log showed he had been transferred, yet no facility ever confirmed his arrival. When she asked, a supervisor told her bluntly, "There are no mistakes here. Only files you don't need to see." That silence became unbearable. By 1950, she began her private record. Every disappearance, every forged transfer, every unexplained death was entered by hand. She wrote in a careful code only she understood, weaving initials with fragments of detail. Ward C, Octon to 3, bed 14 stripped. Mother letter returned. File closed. The notebook fit neatly into the lining of her uniform, slipped under her coat when she left for the evening. Her colleagues noticed her unease. Some warned her against asking too much, reminding her that jobs at Fernald carried rare security in lean times. A physician once caught her lingering too long over a transfer file and snapped the drawer shut with finality. Yet there were others, an orderly, another nurse, who whispered names to her, feeding her quiet rebellion. "Write it down, Dorothy," one told her. "If you don't, no one will ever know." The risk grew sharper in 1953 as the number of vanished children surged. Supervisors demanded stricter adherence to protocol, warning staff against unauthorized duplication of records. Dorothy understood the danger, but each time she copied a name into her notebook, she imagined a mother's unanswered letter and steadied her hand. Her secret ledger grew heavy with absence, 82 entries in that single year, each marked with a date, a ward, and a word she could not bring herself to erase. Gone. Testimony decades later revealed that her notebook survived, hidden in a trunk in her niece's attic, its pages browned and fragile. In its cramped handwriting lay the only surviving record of children the institution had erased from official files. A parallel history, preserved not by the state, but by a nurse who refused to let silence become the final record. Dorothy Sullivan never spoke publicly of her ledger. She left Fernald in 1956, citing family reasons. Yet within her quiet defiance lived the first breach in the institution's wall of secrecy. 2 ledgers remained, one that told the story the state wished remembered, and another that bore witness to the truth. Steel cabinets lined the basement walls of Fernald, their drawers heavy with manila folders, each labeled with a child's name, number, and intake date. Inside were pages crowded with measurements, skull width, dental impressions, blood types, family genealogies, written in an ink that had already begun to fade. When pulled together, these fragments formed something larger than care records. They became the raw architecture of one of America's earliest genetic databases. The foundation was laid in the 1920s, when Fernald partnered with the Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor. Correspondence between Dr. Walter Fernald and Charles Davenport spoke of building a reference library of defective stock, a phrase that reduced children to samples in a hereditary catalogue. By the 1940s, under Dr. Clemens Bender, this ambition expanded into meticulous systems of collection. Each resident was no longer just an intake number. They were a data point in a sprawling map of human heredity. Every aspect of the child's body and history was logged. Daily diet sheets tracked caloric intake. Growth charts plotted height against generational averages. Blood and tissue samples, drawn during routine medical visits, were preserved in glass vials labeled only with codes. In 1948, internal memoranda confirmed shipments of these samples to laboratories at Harvard Medical School and MIT. Officially, they were used for nutritional studies. In reality, they built a hidden archive of hereditary material unmatched in its scope. The ambition was to move beyond the observational. By the early 1950s, new techniques in cytogenetics, staining and photographing chromosomes under microscopes, allowed researchers to begin identifying anomalies. Fernald's children became the unwitting foundation of this research. Their family trees were traced back through parish registers, welfare records, and immigration files. One girl's file contained a 4-generation chart marking alcoholic grandfather, institutionalized aunt, epileptic cousin. Each annotation turned family hardship into scientific evidence of defect. The network of access widened. Reports show that the Atomic Energy Commission received Fernald data for studies on hereditary vulnerability to radiation. The Public Health Service consulted its files to explore degeneracy among immigrant families. Even private industry showed interest. Correspondence between Bender and a pharmaceutical company in 1952 discusses possible screening for metabolic disorders using Fernald subjects. The children's lives flowed outward in charts, tables, and vials, their identities erased as their bloodlines were repurposed for science. The ethical breaches were disguised by the authority of paperwork. Parents were told their children were receiving special educational attention. In truth, Signatures they provided granted access to everything from X-ray exposures to permanent genetic profiling. A single consent form, once signed, opened entire lineages to state examination. The children themselves had no voice in this process. They were observed, sampled, and filed without acknowledgement of their humanity. By mid-century, Fernald was not merely an institution, but a node in a nationwide system of hereditary surveillance. Its records fed into conferences, journal articles, and classified reports. Hidden behind locked cabinets, the files told a story larger than the walls of the school. They charted an ambition to catalogue, predict, and control the human future. In the silence of the basement, among the rows of filing cabinets, the scale of the harvest revealed itself, not just of bodies, but of bloodlines. The air in the parish hall was thick with cigarette smoke and the rustle of paper. Mothers and fathers sat on folding chairs, clutching stacks of unanswered letters, carbon copies and postcards stamped, "No longer in residence." On the table at the front, a ledger lay open, its pages filled with names written in careful hand. Each entry represented a child whose trail had gone dark inside Fernald's walls. The meeting of October 1954 was not the first, but it was the moment the families began to see themselves not as isolated petitioners, but as a collective voice. Mary Brennan spoke first, holding up one of the many letters she had written to her son Tommy. Her voice cracked as she read aloud, "If my boy is gone, tell me. A mother can bear sorrow, but she cannot bear silence." Around the room, heads nodded, some in grief, others in recognition. Another father recounted how he had travelled to Wrentham after being told his daughter was transferred, only to find no record of her arrival. The stories aligned like pieces of a puzzle, forming a picture of systemic evasion. By winter, the parents had retained an attorney, Charles Whitcomb of Cambridge, who spread their letters across his desk in neat rows. He noted the identical phrasing of Fernald's replies, the vague assurances of relocation for study, the conspicuous absence of signatures. In a draft complaint filed with the Middlesex County Court in March 1955, Whitcomb accused the institution of persistent obstruction of parental rights. The case never advanced beyond preliminary hearings. Judges proved reluctant to challenge a state facility, but the filing itself marked a rupture. The parents had entered the legal record. Resistance spread in quieter ways as well. Families began sharing copies of correspondence, building their own archive of absence. In church basements and kitchen tables, they compared dates, signatures, res, and ward numbers. They discovered that multiple parents had been told their child was transferred on the same day, yet to different destinations. Others noted that letters stopped arriving immediately after visits by MIT researchers. The pattern suggested not coincidence, but choreography. Fernald responded with stone walls of silence. Visitors found access increasingly restricted. Those who pressed too hard were told their children's privileges might be revoked. One mother remembered being warned that if she caused trouble, her surviving son's file would be marked not suitable for home placement. Fear tightened the noose around hope, but it did not extinguish it. By 1956, the families had drafted petitions to the governor's office, though few received acknowledgement. Still, their gatherings continued. At one meeting, a father placed a worn photograph of his missing daughter on the table. One by one, others added their own, faces of boys and girls frozen in time, arranged in silence across the wood. For the first time, the families saw the scale of their grief mirrored back at them. Though Fernald resisted every inquiry, the parents' persistence cracked its armor. Their voices, once scattered and ignored, began to form a record no institution could fully suppress. In their hands, the weight of unanswered letters became evidence, and the act of demanding answers, again and again, was itself a defiance that refused to die. The first box was discovered beneath a coat of dust so thick it dulled the lettering on its spine. In 1993, a maintenance worker named James Carver was clearing the basement of a shuttered Fernald outbuilding slated for renovation. As he dragged aside a warped cabinet, the drawer snapped loose, spilling its contents onto the floor, folders bound with rusted clips, their edges curled and brittle. When he lifted one, the air filled with the sour odor of damp paper and old ink. Inside were rosters that did not match the official ledgers preserved upstairs. Names appeared, then disappeared mid-page, with red pencil strokes marking "transferred" beside children whose files had no destinations. One folder contained carbon copies of death certificates signed by physicians never employed at Fernald. Another held letters from parents unanswered, each stamped "received" in violet ink, but never filed with replies. Carver stacked the papers with a janitor's habit of order, but the silence of the basement deepened with every sheet he turned. Word of the find spread quickly. Within weeks, archivists from the Massachusetts State Records Office arrived with gloves and acid-free boxes. They uncovered locked drawers forced open by time, revealing bundles of photographs. Children posed against bare walls, their expressions flat, their names scrawled on the back in pencil. Beside them were envelopes containing dental casts and strands of hair tagged with codes. The basement floor soon filled with rows of cartons, each yielding another fragment of the erased. Among the most damning discoveries were inter-office memoranda. One, dated June 1952, read, "Coordinate transfers to Wrentham and Letchworth under study protocol. Parental contact suspended until completion." Another bore Dr. Clemens Bender's signature, instructing staff to retain subject for genetic value, regardless of home placement requests. These lines confirmed what families had long suspected. Disappearances were not accidents of bureaucracy, but deliberate design. Former staff, confronted with the evidence, offered fractured responses. Some insisted the documents must have been drafts never acted upon. Others admitted quietly that special files had been maintained in the 1950s, hidden from auditors. Nurse Dorothy Sullivan's niece, contacted by reporters, produced the small notebook her aunt had preserved decades earlier. Its entries matched the dates in the basement files almost exactly. Two secret records kept in isolation, now aligned like twin ledgers across time. The revelations reached the press in 1994. The Boston Globe ran the headline, "Fernald's Missing Children. Files Reveal Decades of Silence." Survivors who had once lived in the wards described fragments of memory, friends who vanished, beds left empty, whispers of transfers that never ended. One recalled, "We thought they had gone home. Now I know they never did." The past, long obscured by official denials, resurfaced in the brittle crackle of paper drawn from the dark. The fallout was immediate. Families demanded access to the boxes, state officials promised investigations, and lawyers reopened cases once thought closed. Yet even as the files spread across courtroom tables and news desks, the question remained. If 40 years of concealment could collapse with the opening of a single drawer, how many more cabinets lay sealed, waiting to betray their silence? The first words came haltingly, as if pulled from a place long buried. "I still smell the oatmeal," said Robert Hale, age 60, recalling his childhood at Fernald. "It was warm, thick, but it left a taste of metal on my tongue." His hand trembled as he spoke before a state hearing in 1995. To outsiders it was breakfast. To him, it was the daily ritual of an experiment he had never consented to. Other survivors spoke in fragments, the details surfacing like shards through water. Anna Kowalski, cousin of the twins, described the wards at night, the echo of footsteps, the shadows of attendants moving from bed to bed, the sudden emptiness when a friend's cot remained smooth and cold. "One day you whispered to them before sleep," she recalled, "and the next morning their bed was gone. No one told us where." John Ramirez remembered the examinations. He described a cold chair under fluorescent light, wires pasted to his scalp, and doctors murmuring behind clipboards. The tests stretched for hours. "They said I was helping science," he told interviewers, "but afterward my head ached for days. When I asked what it meant, they just wrote in their books." His file later surfaced in the basement boxes. Subject 311, electroencephalogram trial, June 1952. For some, the memories blurred into sensations rather than events. Sarah Williams recalled the constant smell of disinfectant, the way her skin cracked in winter because the heat never reached the far wards. She remembered the silence most of all, the rule that children were to remain quiet during meals, during examinations, even in play. Silence was safer, she whispered. Noise made you visible. Then there were the dreams, carried into adulthood. Michael Downey spoke of waking in his 40s drenched in sweat, hearing the voice of a boy he once shared a room with. He asked if I would follow him, Downey said. But when I turned, Ned, there was no one there, just the wall. His testimony carried the weight of absence, the missing companions who had never returned. The survivors did not all agree on the details, but their stories shared the same undertow: fear, confusion, and the sudden vanishing of children whose names were erased from the ledgers. Each recollection added dimension to the silence the institution had left behind. To historians, the testimonies were evidence. To the men and women who spoke them, they were fragments of childhood returned in pain. One survivor, asked why he chose to speak after decades of quiet, answered with a steady gaze. Because they wrote us out of the record. If we don't speak, we never existed. His words echoed through the chamber like a warning. The missing children of Fernald could no longer speak for themselves, but the ones who returned carried their voices, fractured and trembling, into the light. The first sound in the courtroom was the gavel, sharp, final, echoing off marble walls that had heard generations of trials. Before the bench lay stacks of settlement documents, their language stripped of feeling. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts agrees to compensate the plaintiffs in the amount of $1.85 million without admission of liability. For the families gathered in the gallery, it was not justice, but punctuation, an official line closing a sentence written 40 years too late. The lawsuits began in 1995, as survivors and families of vanished children filed complaints in Middlesex County Superior Court. Attorneys carried boxes of evidence: Dorothy Sullivan's notebook, the basement files, transcripts of testimonies given by men and women who had once been boys and girls inside Fernald. The claims spoke of negligence, deception, and human experimentation conducted without consent. In one hearing, Judge Elwood McKinney read aloud a parent's letter from 1953 that had been stamped "received" but never answered. The silence in the chamber was heavier than any verdict. The state's attorneys responded with a practiced detachment. They acknowledged past practices inconsistent with today's standards, but denied deliberate harm. Their strategy rested on time itself, arguing that decades had blurred records, that statutes of limitation dulled responsibility. When pressed on the 82 vanished children, they deflected. The records in question are incomplete. We cannot confirm the events alleged. The words hung in the air like a second erasure. Apologies came piecemeal. In 1997, Governor William Weld issued a formal statement. We regret the hardships endured by former residents of Fernald and other state schools. Such practices have no place in our Commonwealth. The families who received the statement in the mail found it printed on heavy paper, the state seal embossed in gold. Yet the language was bloodless, avoiding words like wrongdoing or abuse. One mother, then in her 70s, held the letter aloft and said, "They call this an apology. I call it another form of silence." Settlements followed. Survivors who had ingested radioactive oatmeal received checks ranging from $25,000 to $60,000, depending on their years of participation. Families of those unaccounted for were offered nothing. Without proof of death or transfer, the state argued, no damages could be assigned. In court, a father slammed his hand against the table. "They took my boy. How do you measure that in dollars?" No one answered. Institutional defenders insisted Fernald had been a product of its era, a time when scientific ambition outpaced ethics. Historians testified that similar experiments had occurred at Vanderbilt, at Oak Ridge, at universities across the nation. But for the families in Massachusetts, the breadth of the scandal offered no comfort. Each absence remained personal, each unanswered letter still cut into the present. When the settlements were finalized in 1998, the families left the courthouse carrying folders of documents heavier than the checks they received. Some wept, others sat silent, staring at the signatures that made loss official. Outside, reporters asked if they felt justice had been served. Mary Brennan's surviving daughter spoke quietly. "Justice is not money. Justice is a grave for my brother, and we still don't have one." The gavel had fallen, the documents signed. Yet for 82 families, the silence that Fernald perfected outlasted the courtroom. What passed for reckoning was little more than recognition, cold, late, and incomplete. The helix of DNA glows faintly blue beneath the lens of a modern sequencer, its spirals captured in photographs that fill scientific journals. Each strand represents progress, promise, the possibility of curing diseases once thought untouchable. Yet for some families in Massachusetts, that image is not hope, but a shadow. They know their children's blood, hair, and bones were collected at Fernald long before consent or ethics were considered. They know that in the coils of discovery lie traces of those who never returned. In the archives of Harvard Medical School, researchers have confirmed that samples taken at Fernald circulated through laboratories into the 1960s. Glass vials labeled with codes, dental casts bearing numbers, and charts of chromosome staining remained in storage for decades. Though most were eventually destroyed, fragments of data survived, tables embedded in articles on nutritional absorption, case studies cited in journals of heredity. The children's bodies became invisible contributors to the foundation of modern genetics. For descendants, the legacy is not abstract. Some families, like the Brennans, still gather in living rooms where the empty chair at the table is as present as any relative. Mary Brennan's granddaughter, interviewed in 2010, held up a faded photograph of her Uncle Tommy and said, "They called him defective, but he built the science they still use. He had a purpose. They just never gave him the chance to know it." Her words carried both pride and grief, entwined like strands of the same chain. Ethicists reviewing the case in recent decades have wrestled with its meaning. Was Fernald an aberration, or part of a broader current in American science that privileged progress over dignity? A 2002 symposium at MIT acknowledged the experiments, but some participants argued the knowledge gained had contributed to safer radiation standards. For others, that defense was intolerable. One speaker, a survivor himself, stood and said, "Knowledge without humanity is not science, it is theft." The buildings of Fernald now stand abandoned, their windows boarded, their corridors emptied of voices, yet the silence is not peace. Former staff who walk the grounds describe hearing the rattle of pipes, the echo of doors slamming, as if the institution still kept its watch. For families, the emptiness is worse than sound. Without graves, without names etched in stone, absence itself becomes the monument. Meanwhile, the field of genetics has leapt forward, gene mapping, CRISPR, predictive medicine. But each advancement raises a question the families of Fernald cannot ignore. Whose bodies built this foundation, and at what cost? The secrecy that once governed the wards lingers in the reluctance to name the vanished. The children have been transformed into numbers, data points, invisible architects of a science that outlived them. The story of Fernald does not end with lawsuits or apologies. It remains in the double helix itself, in the coded language of heredity, now read by machines, but written first in the lives of children who were silenced. Their absence is permanent, yet their presence lingers in archives, in family memory, in the very science that sought to erase them. The institution has closed, but its shadow endures, a warning braided into the future. Some legacies cannot be buried.